I never thought I would become this woman, the one who, in the silence of the night, hides secrets so heavy that she can barely bear her own reflection in the mirror. But life has cruel ways of transforming us, and that's how, little by little, I became unfaithful. I always knew something was wrong. It wasn't a single event that made me realize it, but a series of small signs. Things that, if you weren't paying attention, you could easily ignore. Hi honey, before continuing the story, I ask you to give a like to the video. It doesn't cost you anything, and you help me a lot. A kiss, and we continue. Ricardo and I had been married for 5 years, and despite the difficulties we had faced, I still believed we were solid. Our love was strong enough to overcome anything, but something changed. Ricardo started acting strange. First, it was the messages he would receive late at night. He would say it was work stuff, but there was a nervousness in his eyes every time the cell phone vibrated. Then he started coming home later than usual, with excuses that sounded less and less convincing. I wondered if I was overreacting, if it was just my imagination. Maybe it was the stress of work, or some personal crisis I didn't want to worry about. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. One night, after another cheap excuse about an unexpected meeting, I waited for him to fall asleep, picked up his cell phone. My hands were shaking as I typed in the access code, a code he didn't know I knew. I didn't want to be that woman who invades her husband's privacy. But I needed answers. When I opened the messages, my heart sank. There was the evidence I feared. He was exchanging messages with another woman. Her name was Louisa, and the conversations were anything but professional. That night, I did not sleep. I didn't know how to confront him, or even if I should. All I wanted was to understand why. What did Louisa have that I didn't? What was he offering her that I, his wife, couldn't give her? I spent hours analyzing the messages, trying to read between the lines, looking for a reason for what was happening. But there was no simple explanation. It was as if the world I lived in was slowly beginning to crumble. In the following days, I watched Ricardo more closely. Every gesture, every word, every excuse. It was as if I was living a silent nightmare, where he was the protagonist and I was the invisible victim. The pain of knowing about the betrayal and having to pretend that everything was fine consumed me. Inside, I was devastated, but I kept up a perfect facade, smiled when he hugged me, cooked our favorite dinners, and tried not to cry when he left for meetings. I wondered if he would ever realize the damage he was causing, if he knew that I knew it would change anything. I finally knew I couldn't go on like this. Every day, the weight of Ricardo's betrayal became unbearable. I needed to face it, to get that pain out of me. But how to do it without appearing weak? How to reveal the truth and at the same time protect my dignity? I decided I would wait for the right moment, a night when he was relaxed, without defenses. That moment came at the end of a Friday, after a particularly exhausting week for him. Ricardo came home earlier than usual, and to my surprise, he suggested we spend the evening together, watching a movie. As he settled on the couch, I watched him from a distance, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness. He seemed so calm, so comfortable. How could someone who was betraying act so naturally? I sat next to him, forcing a smile, waiting for the right moment to speak. My heart was beating fast, but I knew there was no turning back. It was now or never. During a pause in the movie, when he went to get more wine, I called out to him, "Ricardo, we need to talk." He turned around with a puzzled expression on his face, about which I inhaled deeply. And before he could lose his courage, I blurted out, "Yours and Louisa's." He froze in place. He froze in place. For a second, the silence between us was absolute. I could see the fear and guilt spreading across his face, which he muttered, his voice trembling. I stood up, unable to sit still as the rage boiled inside me. I read the messages. "Ricardo, there's no need to deny it. I know you're cheating on me." He set the wine glass down on the table with too much force, and the liquid spilled onto the wood. His eyes were wide as saucers, trying to process what he had just said. "It was a mistake," he began in a muffled voice, as if struggling to find the right words. "No, I don't know how it happened, Mireille. But it was a bitter laugh, with no trace of joy. Don't you know? You're the one who started exchanging messages with her. You chose this, Ricardo." He rubbed his face with his hands, looking defeated. For a brief moment, I thought he was going to break down right there, that he would confess everything and beg for forgiveness. But instead, he remained silent. The silence was unbearable. I wanted him to say something, anything, to give me a reason not to hate him completely. Finally, he looked at me, his eyes heavy with guilt. "I made a mistake, Julia. But that doesn't mean I don't love you." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to with all my might. But the pain of betrayal was too deep. I didn't know if I could ever forgive him. In the days that followed Ricardo's confession, I felt like I was floating between two realities. There were times when I wondered if I should forgive him, if there was any way to save our marriage. After all, mistakes happen. People are human, and they make mistakes. And love, they say, can overcome anything. But then I remembered the messages, the loving tone he used with Louisa, the jokes and secrets they shared. It was more than a mistake, more than just a physical betrayal. Ricardo had shared a part of himself with another woman, and that, to me, was the most painful thing. He tried to redeem himself. He started coming home earlier, making little surprises for me, like flowers and dinners. But none of it seemed sincere. Every gesture of affection was just a reminder of what he had done. I wondered if I would ever trust him again. As Ricardo tried to salvage what was left of our marriage, I began to pull away emotionally. My mind wandered to dark places, filled with anger and disappointment. And it was in that vulnerable state that another figure entered my life. My father-in-law, Marco. Marco had always been a kind, charismatic man, with an imposing presence. He was the kind of person who filled any space he entered. Since Ricardo's betrayal came to light, I began to notice his presence in our home more. He would come to visit more frequently, always offering advice and support. At first, I thought he was just being the caring father he had always been, trying to help his son fix his marriage. But as the days went by, the way he looked at me and the attention he gave me began to appear different. I didn't know if I was imagining things, if it was just my mind affected by what had happened. Over time, it became clear that Marcos was not there just to support Ricardo. His gestures were subtle at first, a hand resting on mine for too long, a compliment about how I looked prettier every day. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself that he was just being nice, but there was something in his gaze that suggested otherwise. One afternoon, while Ricardo was still at work, Marcos showed up unannounced. He said he was worried about me, that he wanted to make sure I was okay. His voice was calm, almost comforting, but there was a glint in his eyes that made me uncomfortable. "You deserve better, Julia," he said, after a long silence. "Better than what?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "More than what Richard is offering you," his voice replied, low and enveloping. "I know my son has hurt you. You deserve someone who will treat you with the respect you are due. Someone who sees the amazing woman you are." I was speechless. It was either just a compliment in disguise or something deeper. I felt my body tense as Marcos slowly approached. "You know what I'm talking about, Julia. I know you're hurting, and it's natural for you to seek comfort elsewhere, someone who understands you." His words floated in the air like an invitation. And suddenly, what was once a slight tension became something much more dangerous. I wanted to get out of that situation, but at the same time there was something tantalizing in the way he spoke, as if he could fill the void Ricardo had left. But I resisted. That afternoon, I thanked him for his support, keeping a cautious distance. Although I left with an uneasiness that I could not explain, Marco's presence began to occupy a space in my mind that I had not expected. And as the days passed, that presence became increasingly difficult to ignore. My marriage to Ricardo was in pieces, and I hardly knew how to move forward. Despite all his attempts at reconciliation, something inside me was broken. Even though he said he loved me, I couldn't believe it. Every caress of his reminded me of another woman's caresses. Every word of affection sounded false, like a desperate attempt to erase what could not be erased. Marcos, on the other hand, became a constant in my life. He came more often, always with plausible excuses to be around. Sometimes he would bring something he was supposed to talk to Ricardo about, but I knew it was just an excuse to see me. Other times, he would stop by simply to ask how I was doing, and each time that twinkle in his eye was more evident. I was torn. Ricardo's betrayal consumed me, but there was a part of me that couldn't forget what Marcos had said, what he stood for. He was offering me something I didn't know if I was willing to accept. A kind of silent revenge, a way to regain the control Ricardo had taken from me. But at the same time, I knew that crossing that line with my husband's father would be a decision I couldn't go back on. I avoided thinking about it too much, but at night, alone in my bed while Richard slept beside me, I would catch myself imagining what it would be like to give in to temptation. And as the days went by, those fantasies became less impossible. One night, after another discussion with Ricardo about the direction of our marriage, I locked myself in the bedroom. He had tried once again to convince me that everything would be all right, that we could rebuild trust between us, but I no longer believed him. His every word was like a stab. I was no longer the same as before. Marco showed up the next day. He seemed more serious than usual, as if he knew something big was about to happen. This time, he didn't try to hide his intentions. He didn't use euphemisms or play with subtlety. When Ricardo left for work, he looked at me with unusual intensity and said, "I know you can't go on like this anymore, Julia. Ricardo has broken you, but me, I can give you what you need." That was the first time he touched my face. His hand was firm, and at the same time comforting. For a second, I thought about pushing him away, telling him he was wrong, that I would never do something like that. But I couldn't. Instead, I looked him in the eyes, and at that moment, something inside me crumbled. "And what do I need?" I asked, in a voice lower than I expected. "To be truly loved, to be seen." Marcos answered with a terrifying calmness. My thoughts were spiraling. It was wrong, immoral, a betrayal on so many levels. But at the same time, it was irresistible. I was tired of being the faithful woman who always expected to be rewarded for her loyalty. I wanted to feel something, anything, other than this constant pain. And at that moment, Marcos seemed to be the only person who understood. That night, the decision was already made. Ricardo left early for work, as he did every Thursday. Marcos knew the time. He knew when to come. He didn't need to say anything when he showed up at the door. We just exchanged a glance, and I knew what he was thinking. There was no turning back now. When the doorbell rang, I hesitated for a second. It was as if my body knew what was about to happen, and part of me was screaming not to. But another part, the part that had been hurt, betrayed and abandoned for so long, desperately wanted to go on. I approached the door with trembling hands. The sound of the wind outside seemed to resonate with my own thoughts, a constant whisper that reminded me of all my insecurities. I touched the handle, hesitating once again, knowing that what I was about to do would change everything. Finally, I turned the handle and opened the door. Marcos was there, looking at me with the same intensity as before. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The simple fact that he was there said it all. I took a step to the side, leaving him room to enter. It was a small gesture, but loaded with meaning. I had made my decision. As I watched him walk through the door, I felt a mixture of fear and freedom. As I closed the door behind me, the sound of the latch echoed through the house, as if sealing my fate. I was ready for whatever was to come, knowing that nothing would be the same after that gesture.